You really want them to know what great looks like so that they can then start to, again, develop their flavor of that skill.
Welcome to the Leadership Initiative, where we explore the art and science of leadership through thought-provoking conversations with experts, thought leaders, and change makers. Whether you're a seasoned leader or just starting out on your leadership journey, this podcast is designed to provide you with the tools and inspiration you need to lead with purpose and make a meaningful difference.
So, Michelle, I'm excited to talk to you now about developing leaders. And my first question for you, and I think from the name of your company, and also I think knowing some of your experience, you often work with high growth companies, companies who are growing fast. And so while we're going to ask a lot of questions about developing leaders, my first question for you is kind of how do you develop leaders and senior leaders in high growth companies? And how does your approach differ when developing emerging leaders who are still developing their leadership identity in high growth sort of scenarios?
Yeah, well, let's start with the emerging leaders first. My observation is that a lot of times emerging leaders haven't had an opportunity to know what great looks like. So I think when you're coaching an emerging leader, you spend a disproportionate amount of your time making sure that they have the exposure and the experiences so that they can see what it means to be amazing at whatever the skill is that you're going to work with them on. That might mean having them attend meetings or discussion. That might mean getting them a mentor. But you really want them to know what great looks like so that they can then start to, again, develop their flavor of that skill. The other thing I think that is important for an emerging leader is to help them put in place good practices that will help them continue to grow. So examples might be learning how to ask for feedback from their peers, from managers, and how to make adjustments based on that feedback. Always having a development plan. Always have something that you're working on. And even things like installing retrospectives for the things that they're responsible for with their teams. Helping them to put in the practices in place that allow them and their teams to quickly reflect on how something went, to learn from it and move forward. So I think that's kind of where you end up spending a lot of your time when it's an emerging leader. Senior leaders, I think, are different, likely by the time that they've gotten to that point, and by the virtue that they're a senior leader, hopefully they've done well, right? So they've probably seen what great looks like. You don't need to spend as much time on helping to get that experience for them. What's different for a senior leader is oftentimes they have started to develop habits that help them and habits or behaviors that don't help them. And so I think the challenge when you're working with more senior leaders is to help them discover what are the things that they have been doing, the behaviors, the habits, what have they been doing that are not useful towards their goal, and then help them unwind and relearn some new behaviors. That's what a growth mindset is about, is helping others to understand that they can change, they can do things different. That's not always easy for someone in a more senior leader role to do. But if you're being asked to do something or step up in a way that you haven't been before, that's an important thing to do, is learn some new skills.
And that is often hard. You talk about experienced leaders and so forth. One of my favorite books is The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I listen to the same book like over and over. And this one I'm listening to right now. And one of the things that he says is that these leaders of society, they often have their habits and their ways of going about things. And it's very hard to separate that. And so in a way, it's almost a paradox, right? Like the leader who's a senior leader has most likely been very successful and had these, but sometimes the habits that maybe getting in their way, it's often a challenge to get them to be open enough to decide maybe that's not really helping you. Maybe that's actually despite your success, right?
The phrase, what got you here may not get you to the next level.
Yeah.
I see repeated again and again for leaders.
Yep. Well, let's talk about readiness for development. So how do you assess a leader's readiness for development, and what strategies do you use to enhance their coachability? I know you do a lot of coaching, and I suspect you find people enter that relationship kind of in a different state of readiness. So how do you kind of assess that and prepare leaders for that and help them kind of get over the hump maybe if they're not as open to it?
Yeah. So I think your first priority always has to be to make it less scary. And this is, I think, in my case, I'm usually an outside consultant for an organization coming in to coach. But this is true if you're a leader in an organization and you're coaching your team. And that's, how do you make development less scary for people? How do you make feedback less scary for people to receive? There's a book that I really appreciate called Thanks for the Feedback by Stone and Heen. And it talks about feedback conversations there's always a giver of feedback and there's always a receiver. And I can be getting feedback from the most insightful guru, in the world. And if I'm listening with, closed ears, if I'm not interested in growing, if I'm resistant to change, nothing's going to happen from that conversation. And conversely, I could be getting feedback from someone who's terrible at delivering feedback. And if I am eager and interested and willing to grow, change is possible. I can get something out of that. When I think about those roles in a conversation, the giver and the receiver, in light of what I just said, where's the power in the conversation, right? The power is actually in the receiver. It's all about how they receive, and that's most of the work. I coach a lot of leaders on, how do you develop others, and people really always want to start with how do I deliver the feedback, and really the heart of it is learn how to receive it, teach people how to receive it, and the rest of the stuff is, icing on the cake. And so when I think about how do you help improve coachability, it's really starts with teach people to not be fearful of it, give them skills, their specific strategies for how you process the feedback that you get, all those kind of things, but help make it less scary is probably the number one thing. The other thing I think that is important is they need to trust you. And they have to trust that you are doing this with their best interest, as well as the company's. In my case, I'm paid by the company, not the individual. But I better be authentically out for that individual as well, because I'm going to ask them to do new things that might be hard, that might be out of their comfort zone. And I'm a big believer that people will only, they will only, you can only influence them as far as they trust you. And so if I think about those two things, make it less scary, and then make sure that you authentically are worth their trust, I think those are the big things. You ask, how do you know if they're ready for it or not? And I do think that's important. Sometimes you don't get a choice whether someone is ready or not. You have to help them through it anyway. But a good way to do that is, I think, really to give them feedback early and see what they do with it. And again, I'm kind of always erring on the side of iterating or trying it early, testing it out early, because then you'll know, well, at least now I know with this individual, here's how far I've got to go before we can help them get to the other side.
Great. So I'm going to ask you to think about your experiences in working with different individuals and companies about leadership development. What are some of those common challenges that you've encountered in the developmental experience you have, particularly like sessions you have with individual leaders or teams of leaders and so forth? What are some of the reasons why it becomes more challenging or difficult?
I'll give you maybe the top 3 that I think come up most often. One are individual contributors that have been outstanding individual contributors and are promoted into a people leader role, and they all of a sudden, what the skills that they used, the determination, the individual contribution and effort that have gotten them to where they are now are not the same skills that will help them grow their team and lead other people. So it's a big gap. Organizations do this all the time. They promote their best individual contributors to a leader role, and then there's a gap in skill sets. So that's one category. I think a second category that I encounter quite often is leaders who are new to an organization and they don't yet understand the social norms, the culture, and how to get things done. And without being explicit about helping them learn those things, they kind of are left with kind of trial and error. And oftentimes they default to what has worked in a past organization, which may not work going forward. I'm working with a company in Kyrgyzstan right now, and many of the things that I would recommend on how to help people grow or how to help work on operational process I have to run it through a filter, if you will, because their culture is much more collective. It's less individualistic. Calling someone out, good or bad, is not the way to get things done in organizations there. And so my filter, has to be put in place to make sure that the recommendations or the suggestions for these leaders make sense in the organization that they're in. So that's the second group that I see is kind of unknown culture pieces tripping leaders up. The third one, and maybe the one that I get maybe most excited about and most saddened by, are team members that are struggling because no one's ever given them feedback in the past. Wow. That's really frustrating. Maybe it's a leader has inherited someone, but who's been passed around and never really told, here's what you need to do to be successful. Those are the ones that are sometimes easy to fix. You got to have a lot of courage to do so, but are the most frustrating because these are people who could be much bigger contributors now, had someone taken the time along the way and the courage along the way to help get them what they need to grow.
It's kind of like the damnation of low expectations, right? It's
right.
Yeah, we end up, we're helping no one when we do that. And feedback is scary to all of us, I think, but we kind of get conditioned that way. But as you know, it's like the central mechanism for getting better and for enlarging kind of our world and our opportunities. So I think that's a powerful message. Now, Michelle, you talked about kind of two enablers of leadership development, kind of establishing a secure, like overcoming fear for the process, and kind of empowering people. I think one thing that you said in that was I think really insightful, which is that, the recipient is the one who has the power, because they're the ones at the end who are going to be responsible or not for doing anything with the information that we're receiving. So making them feel more secure and less fearful, not so much a fight or flight response, but a more holistic mindset. And then also having trust in the process. So in your toolkit, are there other ways you handle situations where a leader is resistant to change or to coaching?
I think you can't make anyone change. And so I think it has to start with their interest and their willingness to make changes for themselves. It involves, I think, softening the ground ahead of time with them. Ideally, you don't get resistance to the change. Ideally, you're kind of softening things for them ahead of time, helping them to see why now is different, why now is the time, helping to point them to things that they have done before that are places where that they have grown and they're capable of change. And you ideally are trying to not get to a resistance point.
Can I ask you a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
Let's say that, I think as companies have become more evolved in some ways, like the messaging about how we should act becomes a little clearer. So like I could imagine you're meeting with leaders and you're in a coaching relationship or giving them feedback, and they say all the right things, but they don't really, perhaps it only becomes clear to you over time, they don't really translate that into behavior, and you kind of come to the inference like there's something stopping them. Either they're giving me lip service or there's some blockage that I don't understand. So how do you do you encounter that much? And if you do, how do you deal with that? Like they're saying the right things when they're talking with you, but you don't see the results of it.
Now, what really matters are the behaviors that they do when they're outside the room, not in our discussion. At least the model that I prefer is picking some behaviors or some things to do differently with the leader, and having them go out and we say try on the behaviors before we meet next. So maybe they're trying on a different way of, approaching their meetings, their one-on-one team meetings. And then they come back with examples of, okay, when did you do the thing that we talked about? How did it go? What worked? What didn't work? And help them work through those things. When people are resistant to change, what you'll hear is they come back the second meeting and then the third and the fourth, and they will say they didn't have an opportunity to try to practice the new behavior. They may say just generalities and agree with you again about, yes, this is what we want to do, but they
and
can't.
I'm guessing your response to that, but I'm anxious to hear it. Like when they tell you this,
it sounds like you haven't done it yet. And yet, right?
Yeah.
And then usually at least we'll have a couple sessions of just pushing forward. Okay, so this week, is it going to happen this week? Do you need help figuring out when to try it out?
So like creating the opportunities,
creating
or finding
the opportunity
them.
to practice these new skills. And what I like to use the word try on, because I think it's less scary for people. Just you're going to try it. You're going to see if it works and if it doesn't work. And if you come back and it didn't work, we're gonna throw it away and we're gonna come up with something new. When people are resistant to it, they just won't do the behavior. Usually, when the advice is sound enough that if they try on some of these things, they will learn, they will grow, they'll make adjustments, and then we move on to the next thing to try. But if they're resistant, you'll hear it, and their resistance to actually putting the good conversation to use.
So, Michelle, one way to think about you is like you're a master carpenter. You have a big toolkit. You have a toolbox that you take with you, and lots of tools in it. And what I'm interested in, you talked about, I think it was Kyrgyzstan, like a company you're working with there, and how you tailor what you do to the culture. But do you find like your toolkit, is it you're using the same tools, or do you really have to adapt what you're using in your toolbox to the individual or the company based on where they're at and what you see? So how much is kind of the assessment of the problem and the culture of the company, the readiness of the individual part of the tools that you're choosing, or how much of it is just like, okay, I know I've seen this before, this is what I do?
Well, I have been fortunate to have had a lot of the experiences that that the leaders that I coach go through, and in particular because I tend to coach high growth companies. That's was my career experience. So there's a lot of these things that I have seen before, and I hope I have at least a decent number of tools in the toolbox. I think everyone is different. In where their starting point is. So I think there is a couple pieces you find out first before you can say, which tools do I use? The things to know first. And in my case, what is the organization asking of this person? Kind of why did they show up on my doorstep? Question. Is it because they're in a new role and they need to upskill things? Is it because they're underperforming? Is it because they're having challenges with other teammates? Is it because the company is going to do something new and they need this person to be ready? So what is it? What are they really here for? Then what are the goals of the individual? What do they really care about? And what doesn't matter so much to them? And then that culture piece, I think, understanding how things actually get done in their organization. When you're coaching someone, a single person in an organization, I think that can be difficult. You don't get to, you don't have the full kind of 360 of how things work. You only have their perspective. When you're the leader in the organization, you have a great view of, how that works. So I think culture plays a big part. Once you know those three things, though, I do think there's at least a starter toolkit that comes out. One of the starter pieces is helping to get everyone on the same page and of what are we working on. The person's manager, the person's peers, the individual, and get the sticky stuff out on the table so that we're not having to dance around conversations, so that we can have an open discussion. So you can take the scaries out of it and let's just move forward with it. That I think is always kind of the step one to get everyone aligned. I think the next thing you do is you help with the person identify a few, we'll call them keystone behaviors, that will help drive all the other things. And that, I think, takes a good amount of listening and also, some experience to know which behaviors are going to matter and which are not going to matter for this individual's development. And then I think the last piece of that starter kit is finding a couple early wins for them. So what are some things that they can win on for themselves and also in the eyes of their peers, their leader? What can they win on early so we can gain some momentum? And again, it's that track record then that you can help point them to when you ask them to do harder things and harder things and harder things. And so that's usually always kind of my first maybe couple steps. Then from there, it really depends on where the person is, what they're struggling with, where we need to kind of take a couple steps back before we move forward again. And then, the strange tools come out of the carpentry kit.
The awl and the ones you don't have to use as much.
The ones that are less frequent, sure.
Yeah. And I think one of the wonderful things you talked about with this is just the importance of kind of alignment. So to make sure that, I would think one central part of their readiness is that they know and accept what you're working on with them and engaging them with is relevant to their own individual goals, but also relevant and important in the organizational context. Right. And
it's my job as a coach to be able to understand what they're trying to achieve and to help them get there, to help, put this learning in terms that they are interested in, but also to make sure that it's aligned to the goals that they want to achieve. I want to take them to where they want to go, not it's not my own agenda.
I want to ask you a couple of things about success stories, but before that, I have a add-on question. I write down so many questions that I have for you. I can only ask you a few of those, but how important is like the leadership assessment to what you're doing? So when you learn about a leader's kind of strengths, weaknesses, profile, and so forth, how often are you using standardized assessments, or how much of it is just more a subjective opinion you get from talking to different individuals in the organization?
I do think 360-degree reviews are really important. For me, in the beginning of a coaching relationship, they help me understand kind of the totality of an individual. Who they might have good working relationships with some and poor with others, and be successful here but not successful there. So 360s are, I think, a really important element. There are many other tools that I think are also valuable. The build assessment here at the High State University, I think, is a great example of a way to help kind of look at, again, the big picture and decide where you want to focus your efforts. I have another tool that I use called Personalysis, which helps get at kind of personality traits. And for me, it's a shortcut to figuring out where we might need to spend our time. So yeah, I think there's a lot of assessments that help kind of get you maybe grounded and better able to focus your time on what matters most. There's also lots of exercises to have people do. An example would be a peaks and valleys exercise, where an individual kind of thinks through over the last, few years, what are the activities and roles that they've had that have been really highs for them, peaks for them, where they've really enjoyed, where they've really done well. What are the ones that haven't been something that they enjoyed, that they didn't do so well on? And you kind of help listen for threads between those two as another way to say where's a good starting point for us on skills that we need to build. Great.
Well, success story. So I'd be interested, if you are willing, if you could share a success story where your guidance significantly impacted a leader or a company's growth trajectory.
Yeah. So one that that came to mind here is an individual that I worked with, and he was a leader of a development team. This team was a group that we were going to count on to make some roll out new software, to make some big changes. And he was really struggling to do well on his team. He had a very direct approach. He very much wanted to stay in control, wanted to have his ideas be the ones that were used, and he was an expert. But it got to the point where his team was struggling to to be interested in being on his team. Right. This is, we were getting people requests to go to another team. And we needed to keep these folks together. We had to deliver. So he and I started working together. And again, in line with what we talked about before, the first thing was alignment. Get aligned on his perspective of the situation and the organization's perspective. How do we do that? Some very difficult and direct conversations. This one's interesting because we did pretty early on I got buy-in. He was interested in making changes.
Do you think he was aware of the situation?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times people are aware, whether they want to admit it or not is another thing.
It's kind of like sometimes I think things can reside in the back of my head, and sometimes it's an insight or someone's perspective of yours that takes it to the front of my head to kind of conscious recognition.
And a lot of times I think it's just fear of, I don't know how to do it differently. Yep. And so I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to do what I've always done because I don't, no one is sitting beside, along this journey with me, helping me to do something different. So we did identify some behaviors, some specific behaviors, to help make a difference for his team, to help grow his team, and to help position the team for success in what they were about to do. I had done a 360 for the individual when we first started. I had heard the feedback directly from people. We'd worked on the behaviors, and after a few months, I said, how's it going? He said, I've made great progress. And I said, great, would you like me to go validate with your staff and your peers? Yes. So I went out and rediscussed the individual and said, here's some behaviors. Which of these behaviors are you seeing? And we kind of talked about them. I was really surprised at the results. I knew this individual had worked really hard to make changes. And when I went back and I asked, have the behaviors changed? People said no. And I said, well, can you give me some examples? Because I'm going to need to really go back and be specific because we felt like we were making good progress. And someone would give me an example, and then I would say, well, when did that happen? 6 months ago. So I meet with the next person, and they would tell me, no progress made. When did that happen? 5 months ago. Ask another person, when did that happen? Last year. And the pattern that I began to see was he was actually making the changes. Nobody could give me recent examples, even when I pushed them. They were giving me positive recent examples, but they kept saying that no change had occurred. And after some discussions with him later, the conclusion we came to was, kind of elephants have long memories, right? That thing. So people had been hurt by the behaviors that they had seen before or frustrated. And it had gone beyond just, kind of the transactional day-to-day. And he had to somehow repair those relationships before people would recognize the change. So the approach we took is he went back to the individuals and said, hey, I'm working on these specific behaviors, skills, et cetera. And I'm hoping you can help hold me accountable when I do them and don't do them. Then we waited. He practiced for a few more months. We went back to them, and completely different story. They recognized the changes that he had made, and in fact, they'd given him feedback in the meantime. And it was actually a learning experience for me in kind of that change process. And we talk about growth mindset for the individual, right? You actually still, the other people around them have to grow at the same time and change their relationship to get the better results as well. By him going to people and really getting them to help him improve, he got them on his team, right? And not only that, but he coincidentally, developed some skills for how to ask for feedback, how to process it, how to work with others. And now the coaches, I don't need to be a coach in that relationship, right? He's able to do those things on his own now, where in the beginning, I had to prompt people in the 360s to get feedback because that wasn't feedback that they were going to be willing to give. That story has stuck with me, and I've seen it repeated a couple times. It's one of the reasons when I coach people, I encourage them to actually share their development plan with the people that work for them, with the people that work around them, because I think it demonstrates, it models the way, right, for others, but also more importantly, I think it actually allows people to get in your camp, get in your team, and help you. And if there are relationships that have been damaged along the way for certain behaviors, that happens, it's a way to repair them. And so that, to me, has been one of the ones that, for me, stuck with me the most, because it was something I didn't understand from coaching individuals. I just thought they needed to do things different, but sometimes it's actually the environment you have to help them change to make a big impact for the organization.
That's really powerful, Michelle. And I think the transition of this leader from the expert to making himself vulnerable, like, I need your help. I imagine he really had the people's attention when he put it in that way, and that's not always easy to do for us to ask help. And I think the other element of I think what was beautiful about your this situation is hold me accountable for both the areas where I'm doing this and areas where I'm not, and then that resets people. So they've lost their elephant memory.
Right.
And now I'm going to perceive what I see right now. And so I think that's it's a very powerful story, because I can envision that. I think that happens with all of us. Like, we have narratives that fall around us. And if we're trying to change, it's like Jacob Marley, toting the weights and everything. It's sometimes it takes another process.
A reset.
Yes. And it's not just us, it's also the people around us to change their mindset in a way, which I think is really helpful. Well, Michelle, the last question I have for you is metrics of success. So when you're working with a leader or an organization on an leadership development journey, what metrics or indicators do you use to assess whether leaders are achieving their goals?
Well, I think there's two main categories. We'll call them kind of the process indicators along the way, and the results indicators at the end, or the outcome indicators. From a growth mindset perspective, there's a big focus on the process. And what are the behaviors, the actions, the habits that you need to be doing along the way, regardless of if they bear fruit or not. I think those are important, and so in some of to pull from some of the examples we've talked about already, it might be changing, the person changing what they do in a situation when failures happen on their team. This next failure, they do this other, the new behavior. They focus forward instead of, pointing fingers, as an example. So it might be doing the behaviors week after week, doing these new behaviors. But I would say the other category is this results, this outcome component. My perspective here might differ a little bit than maybe what is traditional growth mindset, in that I think the results piece is so critical. And the end, the outcome part is so critical. There's really two main reasons why I think that's important. One is because that's what we're held to. In our organizations, we're held to actually the outcome, what happens at the end, the results, and that's our reality. You need to make sure investors are happy. You need to make sure customers are happy, and they care about the outcome much more than they do that you were doing the right behaviors all along the way. And so I think you have to pay attention to those outcome type indicators. Did the behaviors lead to the right result? The other reason, though, that I think those results are important is because we don't always know the prescription for how to get the results. When we're doing new things, it's one thing if you're the expert and you're talking with a novice and you can say, do these 5 behaviors in a row, and it will certainly lead to success at the end. That's a great place where you can track, process, right? When the process is certain to lead to the positive outcome. I think for most of us, though, the reality is we don't know if we're going to do these 10 things, if they're going to work or not. And we're in uncharted territory all the time. And so part of what you have to do is also have metrics for individuals when you're coaching them that are really results oriented. Did your team then achieve the goal at the end? Did sales do that? Did costs go down as a result? You have to get to there because you're not always the expert and can't tell them here's the exact steps to get there. People have to figure those out for themselves, and so they've got to pay attention to the results and iterate time and time again. Maybe those behaviors are going to work this time. Maybe those behaviors don't work next time. And so I think you have to track those 2 categories of metrics along the way. What specific metrics? I think it all depends on what they're working on at the time.
Well, Michelle, as you can tell, I've been taking notes. Our podcast listeners won't be able to see that, but I always learn so much from talking to you and really enjoyed the conversation. You're a prized asset to the Leadership Initiative, to the College of Business, and to the university. So thanks so much for sharing all your insights, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It was really fun to talk about growth, and I hope that it was valuable and helped some folks grow.
Yep, I know it will be. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. This podcast is presented by the Max M. Fisher College of Business at The Ohio State University. For more episodes, find us on Apple, Google, or podcast.osu.edu/leadership initiative. See you next time.